أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Welcome to another video on René Guénon's Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. Today is November 24th, 2024. I very much appreciate everybody sticking with us all of this time. It's been a long road. We are in the final stretch, inshaAllah. Today's chapter is chapter 27, Psychic Residues. A very, very quick recapitulation of the plan and thrust, as it were, of the argument thus far. In chapter 24, which is entitled Toward Dissolution, Guénon turns his attention to these processes of decay and deliquescence and necrosis in the modern world. And he is examining from chapter 24 onwards these processes of dissolution. As he does this, however, he turns to certain phenomena of a spiritual nature. And so in chapter 25, he looks at what he calls the fissures in the Great Wall, the eruption, as it were, of lower forces of a chthonic and telluric nature, or in a word, dark and demonic energies, and they're being unleashed onto the modern world. And he examines this further by giving the example of shamanism and sorcery. I did remark that chapter on shamanism and sorcery, which is chapter 26, was tinged to some degree by the investigations of what was dubbed shamanism at the time, and I'm not going to speak about that any further. And he segues into chapter 27 in the final paragraph of chapter 26. And I think it is useful to read the conclusion of that chapter, which is chapter 26, because it directly leads us into 27. That's on page 184, beginning with the words, "It is known." So page 184 from chapter 26. Shamanism and sorcery. "It is known that there are in the world a certain number of repositories, in quotes, of influences, the distribution of which is certainly no matter of chance, serving only too well the designs of the powers, in quotes, responsible for the whole modern deviation. But that demands some further explanations, for it may seem surprising at first sight that the remains of what was once an authentic tradition should lend themselves to a subversion, quote unquote, of this kind. And these remains of what was once an authentic tradition, these remains are what Guénon terms psychic residues. Note that he also says powers responsible for the whole modern deviation. These are occult powers. By occult, I simply mean hidden. It doesn't necessarily involve dark forces of black magic and so forth, although that is also a dimension of what another scholar of, or representative of tradition, in my view, capital T, some people among the traditionalists, capital T, have some reservations about him, but what Julius Evola, called the occult war. And these repositories, one of the biggest repositories of such items and artifacts, which represent psychic residues, or are the media for psychic residues of the sort Guénon has in mind, is the British Museum. Yes, the British Museum and other museums like the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, for example, or I suppose the Louvre in Paris. So where they have things like artifacts from ancient Egypt, so the Great Egyptian Museum as well, or items from ancient Babylon and so forth, ancient civilizations. So what is the notion of psychic residue? In this chapter, he is making an analogy. By chapter, I mean chapter 27. He's making an analogy between the psychic remains that are left behind after the death of an individual human being and the psychic remains, collectively speaking, that are left behind after the demise of an entire civilization. So, let us begin. Chapter 27, this is page 185, opening sentence. The last point mentioned, which I just read from 26, in connection with shamanism needs to be clarified, for it contains the main reason for the introduction of the subject. For this purpose, it must be made clear that the case of the persistent vestiges of a degenerate tradition that has lost its superior or spiritual part is fully comparable to the case of the psychic remains left behind by a human being in passing to another state. For these remains can be used for any purpose once they have been abandoned by the spirit. Whether they be made use of consciously by a magician or a sorcerer, or unconsciously by spiritualists, the more or less malefic effects that can accrue obviously have nothing to do with the inherent character of the being to whom they belonged before. They are no longer anything but a special category of wandering influences, to use the terminology of the Far Eastern tradition, and they have kept at the most a purely illusory likeness to the said being. This psychic vestige of the individual, which Genon is talking about here, is called in the Islamic tradition the qareen. Qareen. Qaf, ra, ya, nun. Qareenun. And in the Persianate linguistic and cultural sphere, where the Persian language was important, or much vocabulary from the Persian language was taken into, let's say, Ottoman or Persian or other languages like Chagatai, the word, to the best of my knowledge, certainly in Urdu and certainly in Persian, is hamzad. And hamzad means that which is born with, or the genesis or genesis or birth of which is coincident, temporally speaking, with the birth or coming into being of the soma, to use the Greek term, or the physical body. And in the Islamic tradition, which Genon entered, and I am not sure, to be very honest with the viewers, how knowledgeable Genon was of these sorts of occult matters and what I term Islamic or Quranic theurgic rites. But this is the term, Hamzad or Qareen, and the Qareen is a kind of, it is a jinnic twin, or if you prefer the German word which has come into the English language, a doppelganger. So it's a jinnic doppelganger, to pronounce it the more American fashion. And so there is also a collective residue of a civilization, let's say the ancient Egyptian civilization. And Genon lived in Egypt, and I also lived in Egypt for a very long time. And if you've been there and you've seen the pyramids and you've gone to the various, and there's so many monuments and ancient ruins and sites, you will whether you believe in any of this or not, there's a certain, let us say, energy there. There's a certain feeling, there's a certain ambiance. And this captures something of what Genon is trying to say, but he's not talking about some sort of a subjective feeling. He's talking about genuine vestiges or residues. Now, he says here that it is possible for a human being who is alive to commandeer, as it were, this psychic vestige, this qareen or hamzad of a deceased individual, and use them for their own purposes, because jinn are not really subject to the same spatial and temporal boundaries or parameters that human beings are. And it is in fact not very difficult, I am told, to take control of the hamzad or the qareen of especially a non-Muslim person who has passed away. I don't know why that is. This is simply what I was told. So someone who has freshly passed away, you can actually either attend their funeral or go near their grave. This is what I'm told by people who do these sorts of things. Of course, it's very dangerous, but it can be done. Similarly, one can take control of one's own hamzad while one is still alive. These are things which are not very widely known or talked about in even the Islamic world, but they are no secret either, in the sense that, if you look hard enough, you can find out about them. There is a book which I came across recently, which touches on some of this. Apparently, there is a term in English, but it seems to refer only to the collective version of the hamzad, or the collective notion of the psychic residues or vestiges, and that is the term egregor. And so there's a book by someone named Mark Stavish. He also writes on alchemy. He's an author of some interest. Egregors, the occult entities that watch over human destiny. And so he talks about this phenomenon, and it is an interesting and a very simple and actually easy read. Let me see if there's any passages here. Yes, he defines an egregor. What is an egregor? The word egregor is Greek in origin and is derived from egregoros, meaning wakeful or watcher. The word is found in the book of Enoch, wherein it is described as an angelic being. The book of Enoch is ascribed to Enoch, the grandfather of Noah, and while non-canonical, it has attracted some theological and historical interest by the major Jewish and Christian denominations for a section of it known as the Book of the Watchers. That's page 2, going to page 3. The most commonly used definition, mind you, he takes this from Wiktionary.org, is as follows. So an egregor is an occult autonomous psychic entity composed of and influencing the thoughts of a group of people. However, there's a second definition, an older, more significant, and perhaps frightening one. Here, an egregor is more than an autonomous entity composed of and influencing the thoughts of a group of people. It is also the home or conduit for a specific psychic intelligence of a non-human nature, connecting the invisible dimensions with the material world in which we live. So it would seem, according to Stavish then, that an egregor can also be, and if you read further in the book, can somehow be generated. And so people who are all part of a given religious community or a given cult tap into the egregor, or they create some kind of an egregor. At least this is the way he spoke about it. I had never heard this word, and I came across it a couple of years ago when I was online. I was briefly on Twitter, and there was a very strange clip floating around of what appears to be a Russian or perhaps a Ukrainian woman who claims to be a witch. And this is a clip from an interview, and it was all over Muslim social media about how she's a practicing witch, and she says that she is unable to have any effect on practicing Muslims. And she uses the word egregor because she said they connect with the egregor, their egregor 5 times a day by turning toward Mecca. And I thought this was quite strange. And anyway, I subsequently tracked down this person. This individual is named Zhanna Kushnir. Zhanna Kushnir, Kushnir. Sounds like a Jewish name. Could be like Gerald Kushner. Whatever the case may be, the video can be found on rumble.com in its entirety with subtitles. It's clear that they're speaking what sounds to me like Russian. And it is on a channel called Shadow Control. Very weird. A very interesting interview. It might interest some people who are interested in this phenomenon of psychic residues. And she talks a lot about the kind of magical operations and so forth that she did, and involved going to graveyards and so on. So it's very dark stuff, but interesting. As far as genuine information on the phenomenon of the hamzat or the qareen, The most comprehensive I have ever found is only in the Urdu language. It is in a magazine called Tilsamati Dunya, published by a man in India named Hassan al-Hashimi. And this was the January and February 2001 double issue called the Hamzad number. And here it is for rupees 75, Indian rupees. And there's a lot of very interesting information in here about the phenomenon of the qareen. Again, this is something which I seriously doubt that Genon really knew much about. To return to the subject matter. So he says that there are certain corporeal supports for spiritual energies, and these may be both places or objects. And these objects, they remain charged with psychic elements that are as strong or as persistent as they had been when they were instruments of a living tradition. So once that tradition ceases to be living, those artifacts or those instruments, those objects, continue to retain a kind of spiritual energy, maybe something like a battery, although Genon does not use the term battery anywhere in this chapter. Now, he considers these things to be pretty dangerous because of the possibility of their seizure by what he calls black magicians on page 186. And again, all of this is part of the process of dissolution and anti-traditional action, which eventually goes to subversion. And he doesn't really get into the heart of that theme until 28 and 29, chapters 28 and 29. So he says that the existence of the first of these two sources of danger. So he talks about the danger. I have to go back to the previous paragraph. So it says here, it would be logical to conclude that important traditional and initiatic centers, more or less long since extinct, must in general be the most important potential sources of danger. So the first source would be arising from violent reactions provoked by the psychic conglomerates persisting in such places by sheer imprudence, or more especially from the seizure of those elements by black magicians. So the existence of the first of these two sources of danger goes a long way toward explaining the harmful character of certain vestiges of ancient extinct civilizations when they come to be exhumed by people who, like the modern archaeologists, know nothing of such matters and so inevitably fail to act with prudence. So there was this famous case after the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in the early part of the 20th century, in which many people associated with that archaeological expedition ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best. He goes on to say that is not to say that there may not sometimes be other factors in the situation. For instance, a particular ancient civilization may have degenerated through an excessive development of magic in its final phases. And this is what he considers to have happened in ancient Egypt. So these ancient vestiges, these psychic residues, these persistent psychic influences, when they are deprived of the actual living spirituality that controlled and directed them, they reduce to what Genon at the bottom of page 186 calls a larval state, and can easily by themselves react to a particular provocation, however involuntary it may be, in a more or less disordered manner, and in any case in a manner quite unrelated to the intentions of those who used them formerly for purposes of quite another order. So these things are quite dangerous. On page 187, he says, so under many conditions, the influences in question can be quite pernicious enough, even when they are simply left to themselves. This fact is merely a result of the inherent nature of the forces of the intermediary world, about which nobody can do anything. So it's just like the forces of the more physical forces of nature, such as storms, earthquakes, and so forth. There is a spiritual domain, and when these forces are unleashed, there's really very little that you can. They act according to laws, and And if you know those laws, then that's another matter. So he then returns to the theme of shamanism at the bottom of page 187. So he considers shamanism to be a kind of degenerated tradition, and the techniques of shamanism to represent such a kind of psychic residue. He says on page 188, exactly this sort of thing was in view in quoting an example like that of shamanism. So when you have a tradition that is completely deviated, to the extent, he says, that it is really dead as such, just as dead as a tradition that no longer even appears to be in existence, if there were any life left in it, however little, no such subversion could in any event take place, for it consists in nothing but a reversal of what remains of the tradition, so as to make it work in a direction by definition anti-traditional. It is, however, as well to add that before things reach that point, and as soon as traditional organizations are so diminished and enfeebled as no longer to be capable of adequate resistance, the more or less direct agents of the adversary. Now, by the adversary, he means shaitan, and he says so. He means the devil in a footnote. So these, the adversary, or those who do the bidding of the adversary, can commandeer these psychic energies for their own purposes. On page 189, he introduces another consideration, saying, another consideration having its own importance is this: if the adversary, as to whose nature some more exact indications will follow. Now, in the footnote previously, he says that the term adversary is a direct translation of he says the Hebrew word shaitan, but shaitan is the Arabic form. I think in Hebrew it is not shaitan, it is satan in Hebrew. At any case, the term Satan and satanic comes from there. So he says another consideration having its own importance is this: if the adversary, and then he reveals more. It says, as to whose nature some more exact indications will follow. That's on page 196 and 198, which we will get to. So, if the adversary has something to gain by taking possession of places that were the seat of former spiritual centers, it is not solely because of the psychic influences accumulated in them and more or less free to be made use of, but it is also for the very reason that the places are where they are. Here he introduces the theme of sacred geography. Many of these ancient sites are built on certain very powerful locations, or where there is a tremendous kind of spiritual potency. And so you will find that, for example, the Great Pyramid is built over an ancient aquifer. Or there are telluric currents, by telluric currents I mean in the more physical sense, geomagnetic currents, electricity and magnetism coursing through the earth. And you find this to be true in many, many situations. You find that there are certain lines, which in English are called ley lines, but it's spelled L-E-Y. You can search for this on the web and you will find a lot of information. And you'll find that a lot of ancient sites lie on such lines. In other words, these lines connect such centers, so to speak, or loci of tremendous energy. And many of these ancient sites are built on those. Now, it may interest you to know that Nikola Tesla built some of his most powerful, let's just call them devices, also above aquifers. And he was doing research on the nature of electricity. So these are sites of a kind of energetic intensity where there is a tremendous amount of potential telluric currents that can be used. And so there is a physical dimension also, or manifestation of spiritual energies. And I think a lot of that has to do with electricity and magnetism as they are portrayed in modern physics. But I concur with Genon that modern science, all modern sciences should have, and all manifestations of the modern world should have the term pseudo put before them. So this is more of a pseudoscience. And if any modern physicist or electrical engineer, or the vast majority of the orthodox ones, tell you that they understand electricity, this is simply absolute folderol nonsense. Very, very, very few people really understand electricity at all. And one of the only ones who is alive today is someone named Eric Dollard. You can look into him if you like. Sacred geography, the knowledge of which determines the choice in question, is susceptible, like every other traditional science, of a contingent order of being diverted from its legitimate purpose and of being applied inversely. If a place is privileged to serve for the emission and direction of psychic influences when they are operating as vehicles of a spiritual action, it will be no less so when these same psychic influences are used in quite another way and for ends opposed to all spirituality. It may be observed in passing that the danger of the misdirection of certain kinds of knowledge, of which this last is a very clear example, accounts for much of the secrecy that is quite natural in a normal civilization. So these were esoteric doctrines, the doctrines of sacred geography, the doctrines of sacred geometry that are part and parcel, or that are fundamental to the construction of buildings of a sacred ritual character in ancient civilizations. Interestingly enough, if you watched my recent video about recent books, which I purchased, some of this is talked about at some length, I might add, in Iamblichus's book on the mysteries. You will also find useful information in this regard in the works of Gregory Shaw. One is called Hellenic Tantra, and the other one is called... Hellenic Tantra is shelved elsewhere. His first book is called Theurgy and the Soul. This is about Iamblichus. Iamblichus was an ancient sage in the line of Plotinus. His teacher was Porphyry. And a final footnote, you will find information of a quite profound character touching on this theme in the works of Shihabuddin as-Suhrawardi al-Maqdul, especially in portions of Hikmatul Ishraq, or the Wisdom of Illumination, which is translated into English, and other works. So, modern people are very much against any notion of esotericism or esotericism or secrecy, and they do not understand this at all. They commonly mistake what is really a measure designed as far as possible to prevent the misuse of knowledge for a desire to monopolize that knowledge. And in truth, secrecy only ceases to be effective when the organizations that are the repositories of the knowledge in question allow unqualified individuals to penetrate into their ranks. For these individuals may even be agents of the adversary, of shaitan, of the counter-initiation, of anti-traditional action. And if they are so, one of their first objects will be to discover the secrets. All this has, of course, no direct relation to the true initiatic secret, which resides, as explained earlier, exclusively in the ineffable and the incommunicable, and is therefore obviously protected from all indiscreet research. This is very true. The true initiatic secret is only attained by those who are worthy. Nevertheless, Genon continues, although none but contingent matters are in question here, it must be recognized that the precautions that may be taken within the contingent order, with a view to avoiding all deviation, and thus all harmful action that might arise from it, are far from having in practice only a relatively negligible interest. I will have something further to say on that before we conclude, shortly before we conclude this video. let's just conclude the chapter. Genon's concluding paragraph. In any case, whether it be a question of the places themselves, of the influences remaining attached to them, or again of knowledge of it, the kind just mentioned, the old adage, corruptio or corruptio optimi pessima. In other words, corruption of the best is the worst. In other words, the corruption of the best is the worst of all possible corruptions. So he invokes this adage, and then he says that this adage may be applied perhaps more accurately here than in any other case. And moreover, corruption is just the right word, even its most literal sense, for the residues here concerned are, as stated at the beginning, comparable to the products of the decomposition of a once living being. And as all corruption is more or less contagious, these products of the dissolution of things past will themselves exercise, wherever they may be projected, a particularly dissolving and disaggregating action. All of this may be likened to a sort of necromancy, making use of psychic remains quite other than those of human individuals, and it is by no means the least redoubtable, meaning the most formidable or to be feared, a redoubtable sort, for it has by its nature a field of action far more extensive than that of common witchcraft. Indeed, no comparison between the two is possible in that respect. Matters have reached such a point nowadays that our contemporaries must indeed be blind not to have even the least suspicion of where they stand. And that's it. And that's very, very true. These forces exist. They are and have been pressed into service by the legions of the devil, by the awliya ush-shaytan, those who are close to the adversary. Yet modern people have almost no idea how to protect themselves from these things. So I will share with you a means of protection. And I was told, I cannot entirely verify this, but I was told by people who knew Genon in Cairo that he always exercised precautions in this regard. No, and what he actually did, we can't be entirely certain, but the vast majority of Muslims, to protect themselves from these kind of demonic and satanic influences, recite the last two chapters of the Quran. So that's Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas. So the Surah Al-Falaq is Surah 113, begins Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qul a'udhu bi Rabb al-Falaq. Then chapter 114 is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qul a'udhu bi Rabb al-Nas, to the end of the chapter. They're very short. And everybody knows those, but there is something which I'm going to share, which I don't know if anyone has made any videos on this. And I know this by heart, but if I start reciting, I have to recite it very quickly, otherwise I'll mess up. So I'm going to go to the right page of the Quran. So there are some verses in the Quran that are especially efficacious in providing this kind of spiritual protection or spiritual armor. So there are two verses in the Quran, and they're known as the verse of the Qutb, or the axial verse, the northern polar axial verse and the southern polar axial verse, or Ayat al-Qutb al-Shimali and Ayat al-Qutb al-Junubi. And so the first of these is from Surah Al-Imran, verse 154. And then the other one is from Surah Al-Fath, which is the last verse in that surah. If you recite the 154th verse of Surah Al-Imran 11 times a day, you will be protected from magic, from other occult, malefic, demonic influences. It's best if you learn it by heart, and you should precede it by reciting salawat on the Prophet 11 times before and after. The verse is as follows. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ثم أنزل عليكم من بعد الغم أمنة نعاسا يغشى طائفة منكم وطائفة قد أهمتهم أنفسهم يظنون بالله غير الحق ظن الجاهلية يقولون هل لنا من الأمر من شيء قل إن الأمر كله لله يخفون في أنفسهم ما لا يبدون لك يقولون لو كان لنا من الأمر شيء ما قتلنا هاهنا قل لو كنتم في بيوتكم لبرز الذين كتب عليهم القتل إلى مضاجعهم وليبتلي الله ما في صدوركم وليمحص ما في قلوبكم والله عليم بذات الصدور. صدق الله العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين. So this is the verse. You can look up the translation yourself. This is very, very powerful. And if you know how to use it, you can also recite it and blow it onto people who may be possessed, or if you want to determine if they are possessed and so on and so forth. And that is a whole other science. But I'm just making this known so that people can avail themselves of this protection. You can also do the same with the last verse of Surah Al-Fath, which begins Muhammadun Rasulullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Muhammadun Rasulullah walladhina ma'ahu ashidda'u 'alal kuffari ruhama'u bainahum tarahum ruk'an sujadan yabtaghuna fadlan min Allah wa ridwanan simahum fi wujuhihim min athari as-sujud dhalika mathalun fit tawrati mathalun fil injili kazarin akhraja shadhu fa'azara fastaghlata fastawa 'ala suqi yu'jibu zur'an yaghidhu min al-kuffari wa'ada Allahu alladhina amanu min as-salihati minhum maghfiratun wa ajrun 'azima. That's it. What is so special about these two verses of the Quran? What is special about them is that they contain every single letter of the Arabic alphabet. The Arabic alphabet, in its esoteric meaning, represent all the modalities of manifestation. And they're like the ultimate sort of principles, cosmological principles, you could say. In ancient Greek, they would have been called stoichia, if I'm not mistaken. They also used that term in Greek for the letters of the Greek alphabet. And indeed, there's an entire theurgy of the letters of the Arabic alphabet, but this is a vast topic, and I will simply conclude with that little nugget of information, and I shall see you in the next video. Thank you very much.